He signed a document in order to bring a curse down against his enemy, and he promised that he will return. That was his curse, and I will take revenge against those that they betrayed me. He was killed, and his body was buried in a monastery nearby Bucharest. Later on, when they opened the coffin, they never found his body.
What kind of ruler burns his own land to starve an enemy, or mutilates prisoners just to send a message home? To most, that's the edge of cruelty. For Vlad the Impaler, it was only the beginning. He forged fear into a weapon, using terror to break armies, rattle empires, and twist the rules of war itself. Stay with us, because each act peels back something darker than the last. To understand how Vlad turned fear into a weapon, we must start with the boy who first learned its power as a captive in his enemy's fortress. The kid who learned hate in the lion's den.
Vlad III Basarab, better known as Vlad the Impaler, he was nicknamed Dracula, which means the son of the devil.
They called him Vlad the Impaler, a monster, a tyrant, a prince who turned cruelty into legend. But before he was the terror of Europe, he was just a boy forced to watch horrors that would scar him for life. The year was 1442. Wallachia, his homeland, was trapped between two giants, Hungary on one side, the Ottoman Empire on the other. His father, Vlad Dracul, tried to play both powers at once. Sometimes he fought with Hungary. Other times he bowed to the Sultan. But when his gamble failed, the price wasn't his own blood, it was his son's. Vlad, barely 11, and his younger brother Radu were handed over to the Ottomans as hostages. Their new home? The Egrigoz Citadel, a fortress buried in the Anatolian hills. And while they weren't thrown into a dungeon, make no mistake, they were prisoners, noble prisoners, fed fine meals, given tutors, taught horsemanship, swordplay, the art of siege. But all that comfort was just decoration. Everyone knew what they were, leverage over their father, and it didn't shield them from what they saw. From the courtyard, Vlad watched as prisoners were dragged before sharpened stakes. Guards drove the wood through their bodies, raising them upright while they screamed. Sometimes they lasted hours, sometimes days. The corpses hung there, left for the crows. It happened often enough that the smell, the sight, the sound burned into the boy's memory. Radu adapted. He bent, he converted, even grew close to the Sultan's son, Mehmed, who would later be known as the Conqueror. But Vlad? He hardened. He trained with a fury no teacher could miss. Every sword stroke was rage. Every lesson in Ottoman tactics was a reminder of his homeland's weakness. Then news from Wallachia hit like a blade. In 1447, his father was dead, overthrown, beheaded. His older brother Mirza, captured. Eyes burned out, buried alive.
And by the time his father and brother were killed, his hatred had grown so virulent.
To Vlad, it wasn't just Hungarian rivals behind it. It was betrayal woven through Ottoman hands while he sat powerless in their fortress. By his mid-teens, Vlad was no longer just a hostage. He was something else, a survivor, fluent in the language and warfare of his enemies, fueled by grief, hardened by hatred. And when the Ottomans finally let him go, he didn't return home as a boy. He returned as a weapon, a ruler in waiting who had learned the darkest lesson of all. Fear was power. The same boy who once stood in a citadel courtyard, staring at men writhing on stakes, would one day rule by perfecting that terror. And the empire that once taught him cruelty? Even they had no idea how far he would take it. The blood-soaked throne. What kind of ruler wins a throne not by battle, but by luring his enemies to a banquet and leaves them writhing on stakes by sunrise? That night in 1448 announced that the boy hostage had returned to Wallachia as a predator. 17-year-old Vlad Dracula came back from years as an Ottoman captive, hardened by drills, and fueled by the memory of his father's murder and his brother's torture. The Sultan, thinking to use him as a pawn, gave him a small force and sent him to reclaim the Wallachian throne from his cousin Vladislav II. Vlad crossed the Danube under cover of darkness, rallied local loyalists, and marched into Targovishte while his cousin was away on campaign. By dawn, the throne was his. But the real danger came not from absent armies, but from the boyars, the powerful nobles who had betrayed his father. Pretending to seek their support, Vlad invited them to a lavish feast. They came dressed in furs and jewels, greeted with wine, music, and overflowing tables. Yet, as the celebration peaked, his guards sealed the doors. In a moment, the hall turned from festivity to slaughter. Some nobles were cut down where they stood. Others were dragged outside. By sunrise, sharpened stakes lined the palace yard, the bodies of the realm's most powerful men impaled for all to see. The massacre shocked the land into obedience, briefly. Within weeks, Hungarian forces backed Vladislav's return, and Vlad fled into exile. He took refuge in Moldavia under his uncle Bogdan II and forged a bond with Stephen, the future ruler of that land. When Bogdan was assassinated, Vlad fled again, biding his time under the protection of his one-time enemy, John Hunyadi. That patience paid off. In August 1456, at 25, hardened by Hungarian war campaigns, Vlad returned. With Hunyadi dead, his son Matthias Corvinus backed Vlad's claim to the throne. Facing his cousin again, Vlad wasted no time in a drawn-out war. Before their armies, he struck Vladislav down in single combat with a single thrust of his blade. Once back in power, Vlad unleashed terror on a new scale. He summoned the boyars under the guise of rebuilding the realm, only to have them march to fields outside the city where sharpened oak stakes waited. The victims, stripped, bound, and forced down the stakes, died slowly in the sun, sometimes for days. The horror spread beyond Wallachia. Merchants, criminals, and even suspected Ottoman sympathizers met the same fate. Saxon towns that defied him saw raids, mass executions, and forests of stakes planted outside their gates. The message was clear. In Vlad's Wallachia, loyalty was survival. The throne he won in blood became a seat of terror, and his rule carved fear deep into the land, a fear that would follow him into legend. The Saxon slaughter, when foreign merchants learned theft, meant 1,000 screams. Centuries later, chroniclers still argue over the exact number, hundreds or more than 1,000. But they agree on this. When Vlad the Impaler turned his wrath north toward the Saxon merchants, their walled cities became graveyards, and trade routes that had thrived for generations went silent overnight. By the mid-1550s, Vlad's terror had already cowed Wallachia's boyars, but the Saxon merchants in the northern towns of Brasov and Sibiu thought themselves untouchable. Backed by royal charters from the Hungarian crown, they had long dominated local markets, undercutting Wallachian traders, skimming taxes, and bribing clerks to look the other way. The breaking point came when a Wallachian peddler from Targovishte was robbed and beaten at Brasov's gate by a Saxon crew. His goods were stolen, his wagon burned, and he was left half dead in the mud. The report reached Vlad not as a complaint, but as a provocation. Instead of sending envoys, Vlad mounted his horse at the head of several hundred riders and crossed the mountains before dawn. Brasov woke to the sound of rams breaking their gates and the sight of the black and red dragon banner rising over the square. There were no negotiations. Vlad's men dragged merchants from their homes, tore guild leaders from their prayer benches, and bound them in ropes for judgment. By noon, the fields outside the town had become an execution ground. Fresh oak stakes were driven deep into the soil, their points greased to prolong the agony. Victims were stripped and forced onto the stakes, the sharp ends piercing upward through the body, before the poles were raised and left standing. Saxon reports sent to Vienna spoke of merchants and guild leaders lined up in ranks, their fine boots dangling just above the ground as they writhed and screamed for 2 days before dying. For the ringleaders, Vlad ordered extra punishments: ears cut off, noses sliced, or faces mutilated before the impalement began. Homes and forges were torched, and the trade houses that had once been bustling hubs were reduced to ash. Vlad seized Saxon ledgers and silver, redirecting the wealth to his loyalists and to the families of Wallachians harmed by the merchants. Trade through foreign guilds collapsed, and local markets began to recover under his brutal but effective control. The slaughter terrified neighboring towns, but it also drew the attention of the Ottoman court. Mehmed's spies reported that Vlad was growing too bold, defying both Hungarians and Turks. The quiet that followed in Wallachia's markets was the calm before a far greater storm. If this chapter of Vlad's brutal campaign gripped you, hit the like button to help bring more of history's darkest and most untold stories to light. The Untouched Cup, when fear made a city freeze. Long after the Saxon fields had cooled and their trade routes lay in ashes, another story began to spread across Wallachia, one that sounded like a tavern tale but was witnessed by thousands. In the heart of Targoviste, the bustling capital where tens of thousands of merchants, farmers, and travelers crossed paths each week, a solid gold cup appeared at the public fountain. It was heavy, worth a fortune, and chained loosely to a marble post where anyone could reach it. The rule was simple: drink from it if you were thirsty, but if you tried to take it, you would pay with your life. No guards watched over it, no walls or locks shielded it, yet for months, not a single person dared to move it. The cup remained where it had been placed, water sloshing quietly inside while the crowd gave it a wide berth. That eerie self-restraint wasn't magic. It was the lingering memory of a night in the capital that had burned itself into the minds of everyone who lived through it. The city had been struggling with beggars, the starving, the sick, and the crowding of the markets. Vlad announced a banquet for them, promising a meal like no other. Riders went through the streets, gathering hundreds of the poor and leading them to the great hall beyond the city walls.
Vlad III Basarab, better known as Vlad the Impaler, he was nicknamed Dracula, which means the son of the devil.
They found tables overflowing with roasted meat, bread, and ale. For the first time in years, the hungry feasted without fear. Then the doors shut. Vlad appeared on a balcony and told them they would never suffer again. Torches were thrown into the hall, and within minutes, the building was an inferno. The beggars screamed as the flames consumed them, the doors barred to keep them in. By dawn, the hall was a heap of charred timber and ash. The streets were suddenly free of beggars, but the memory of that night haunted every survivor. So when the golden cup appeared in the square, no one needed a guard to protect it. Every man, woman, and child knew the price of crossing Vlad's unspoken line. That unshakable order made Wallachia stronger, and its markets thrived. But it also caught the attention of the Ottomans across the Danube. Soon, envoys from Sultan Mehmed II arrived, demanding tribute, as if Vlad were another petty lord to be bought off. They did not yet understand what that cup had shown his own people, that fear in Vlad's hands was sharper than any sword. Nailed turbans, the blow that made empires bleed. When 3 Ottoman envoys rode into Vlad's court, they expected gold, wine, and a signature on the Sultan's tribute demand. Instead, they left with their turbans nailed to their skulls, alive enough to crawl back across the Danube and spread the tale. That single act, brutal and defiant, was more than an insult. It was a declaration that Vlad Dracula would rather drive iron into flesh than bow to an empire. By late 1461, Wallachia was steady under Vlad's grip. Markets ran honestly, and the golden cup in the capital's square still sat untouched. But across the Danube, Sultan Mehmed II, fresh from crushing Serbia and now eyeing Europe, decided it was time for Vlad to pay. He sent envoys north to demand tribute in silver, and boys for the Janissary Corps, the elite Ottoman troops carved from Christian captives. The three envoys arrived in Targovishte, expecting the usual show of respect: gifts, a banquet, and the prince's signature on new tribute terms. They stood in Vlad's hall under white flags, scrolls in hand, turbans wrapped high as symbols of their faith and rank. Vlad sat on his throne, fingers locked together, as he listened in silence. Then, as if it were a trivial courtesy, he asked them to remove their turbans, in respect for his court's custom. The lead envoy refused, saying Ottoman law forbade bearing one's head before an infidel prince. The hall went still. Vlad's smile sharpened as he replied, "If you will not take them off, then we will help you keep them on properly." Guards stepped from the shadows with hammers and long iron nails. Before the envoys could shout, they were seized, their turbans pulled tight. The first hammer blow cracked through cloth and bone, as their turbans were nailed to their skulls. Blood streamed down faces as screams tore through the chamber. Vlad watched without a word, then ordered the survivors released. Broken but alive, they staggered south to carry the story back to Mehmed's court. The news hit Istanbul like a slap. The Sultan's pride burned hotter than his anger. To be mocked this way, through his envoys and his faith, demanded retribution. Mehmed dispatched Hamza Pasha with 8,000 men to march north and make Vlad pay.
A new crusade to reclaim Constantinople and push the Ottomans back to the desert.
But Vlad had already prepared the mountain passes, narrowing the roads like a trap. The confrontation that followed would turn a quiet valley into a graveyard and prove that the prince's hammer was only the beginning. The Forest of Stakes, a valley that stopped an empire. When Ottoman scouts rode into a Wallachian valley and saw what looked like a dead forest of 20,000 human bodies raised on stakes, they turned their horses and fled. That sight, rows of impaled soldiers swaying in the wind, froze even the hardened Janissaries and stalled an empire that had marched through sieges and plagues. The roots of that nightmare were set months earlier. Mehmed II, enraged by Vlad's brutal treatment of his envoys, sent Hamza Pasha north with 8,000 men to crush the defiant prince and force Wallachia to pay tribute.
Success was still within their grasp, and so he led his men into the capital city.
Vlad responded with a letter offering peace talks and tribute at a mountain pass, bait that Hamza swallowed whole. Confident of an easy submission, he led his column into the narrow gorge, cannons rumbling behind as mist curled low over the slopes. Before dawn, the trap sprang. Gunpowder caches hidden in the rocks erupted, blasting boulders down on the vanguard. As the column reeled in chaos, Wallachian riders surged from the cliffs. Arrows rained, swords cut through broken lines, and the pass became a slaughter pen. By midday, thousands were dead. The rest, including Hamza himself, were dragged out alive, bound and waiting for something far worse. That night, Vlad's men felled oaks and sharpened them into thick stakes, greasing the tips to ease the impalement. At dawn, the captives were stripped, tied, and forced onto the stakes, points driven carefully upward through the lower body to prolong the agony. Hamza was set at the tallest stake in the center, his body sliding down slowly until the tip pierced out of his mouth. The rest were arranged in grim ranks that stretched for miles, a dreadful wall of flesh. Eyewitnesses left chilling accounts. Tursun Bey, Mehmed's own chronicler, wrote that even veteran Janissaries gagged at the sight, and their horses balked at the smell. Some of the impaled were still alive for days. Their moans carried on the wind. Birds circled overhead, feeding on the dead, while the living suffered. When word reached Mehmed in Istanbul, the conqueror of Constantinople slammed his fist on his table. The vision of that valley, 20,000 dead forming a living warning, unsettled even him. It slowed his campaign through the winter as desertions rose in Ottoman camps, but by the spring of 1462, Mehmed gathered 90,000 troops and massive cannons, determined to break Vlad and erase the forest of stakes with fire and steel. The deep raid, 23,000 heads for the stakes. When Mehmed's scouts first counted the stakes in Hamza's valley, they thought nothing could be worse. Then, in the spring of 1462, Vlad carried the horror deep into Ottoman soil and left behind 23,000 more bodies, proof that the Impaler could strike far beyond his own borders. As the Danube softened and the river swelled, Vlad raised a force of about 30,000. Most were not trained soldiers. They were farmers with sharpened tools, Roma scouts who knew the land, even boys barely grown. They wore cloaks stripped from dead Ottomans to pass for locals. Vlad, fluent in Turkish, rode at the front on his black horse, using the language to deceive garrisons into opening their gates. The first villages in Bulgaria fell without a warning shot. Vlad's men posed as refugees fleeing Hungarian raiders. Gates opened at night, and the slaughter began before the alarm could ring. Soldiers were cut down in their sleep, tax officials dragged from their ledgers, and families caught unarmed. The attackers left stakes at every village crossroads, and wood from fences and orchards was driven through the victims slowly to prolong their deaths. For 2 weeks, the raiders moved like a shadow across more than 800 kilometers, burning fields and granaries, poisoning wells with animal carcasses,
poisoned with entire populations, including animals, being evacuated,
and cutting down anyone who resisted. Chroniclers claimed 23,000 Ottomans died. Roads leading toward Sofia were lined with impaled bodies, rotting under the sun as warnings to reinforcements. When Mehmed's Grand Vizier, Mahmud Pasha, tried to retaliate by sending 18,000 troops to seize Braila on the Danube, Vlad ambushed them in the river fog. Arrows struck first. Then Wallachian cavalry slammed into the disordered ranks. Survivors were driven ashore and impaled.
Can all be traced back to one terrifying ruler and his supernatural evil.
Another 8,000 added to Vlad's grim display. News of the raid and the ambush reached Rome, where the Pope praised Vlad as the scourge of the infidel, and in Buda, Matthias Corvinus toasted him as a defender of Christendom. For Mehmed, it was humiliation. Reports of the burning villages and the stakes filled his court with rage. That summer, he gathered an army so large, between 150,000 and 300,000 men, that it dwarfed anything seen in the Balkans. At its head rode Radu, Vlad's own brother, now the Sultan's ally. Mehmed crossed the Danube, determined to crush the prince who had turned his own methods against him. The raid had not won the war. It had ignited it, setting the stage for the night attack that would make Mehmed himself feel hunted. Scorched earth and the night attack, bleeding the beast before striking. The Ottoman soldiers expected a straightforward march to crush Vlad. What they found was an empty, poisoned land, and, in the end, a night assault so sudden and brutal that even Mehmed the Conqueror nearly fell to it. By the summer of 1462, Mehmed crossed the Danube with close to 90,000 men, janissaries, cavalry, artillery, and followers hauling supplies. At their front rode Radu, Vlad's own brother, with 4,000 horsemen. Against them stood Vlad's smaller, ragged force of about 30,000, mostly peasants and townsfolk armed with whatever they could hold. Vlad knew a pitched battle would destroy him,
planning a surprise attack on the Sultan's army. It was his personal intention to enter the Sultan's tent and drive a knife through Mehmed's heart.
He chose to starve and exhaust the invaders first. He ordered the countryside emptied. Villagers fled north with what they could carry. Livestock were slaughtered and left to rot in the fields. Wells were poisoned, and crops and granaries burned. To make it worse, Vlad sent people infected with plague into areas where the Ottomans would camp. A letter he later sent to the Hungarian king confirmed it in his own words. He had burned everything, leaving nothing for the enemy to eat or use. Ottoman columns moved through the wasteland, finding no shelter, no food, and fouled water. Horses weakened, soldiers sickened, and morale began to crack. Desertions grew. Small Wallachian raiding parties struck at night, burning tents, killing pickets, and vanishing before dawn. Even Mehmed grew uneasy. ordering tighter guards. Then came the strike that entered legend. On the night of 17th June, 1462, Vlad split his army into two wings, about 24,000 men, and disguised prisoners as captives to lure the enemy's attention. Under the thin moon, they struck from both sides. Horns sounded low, blades cut through the outer lines, and chaos spread through the massive camp. By morning, about 15,000 Ottomans lay dead for only 5,000 Wallachian losses. Vlad had missed the Sultan's tent in the confusion, but he had shattered the invaders' confidence. Mehmed pushed on toward Târgoviște, but when his army reached the city's outskirts, they found the old field of stakes still standing. 20,000 corpses from earlier battles, now skeletal, but still terrifying. The stench and sight unnerved even veteran Janissaries. Mehmed, unwilling to risk more, turned his main army back across the Danube, leaving Radu with a garrison to hold what they had taken. The victory bought Vlad a short reprieve.
Legend has it that she vowed to feed herself to the fishes rather than fall to the Turks.
But the campaign's horrors had alarmed not only the Ottomans, but also his supposed allies in the north. Hungary's king, Matthias Corvinus, was already preparing the snare that would end Vlad's defiance. Maimed messengers and the last stake, the Impaler's final lesson. Historians still debate which was worse, the forests of impaled bodies or the mutilated survivors Vlad sent back across the Danube. These broken men, maimed but alive, carried his message better than any army. In the weeks after Mehmed's retreat in the summer of 1462, Vlad's horsemen patrolled the riverbanks, seizing Ottoman scouts and officers who had strayed behind the main force. These prisoners were not killed outright. In torch-lit clearings, Vlad's men cut off noses and ears, sometimes branded faces and chests with hot irons bearing the dragon emblem of his old order. Eyes were gouged or seared shut. A few victims had limbs hacked off, and the stumps were roughly seared so they could live long enough to crawl home. Chroniclers from Slavic and Byzantine sources agree that these survivors were deliberately spared so they could stagger back into Ottoman territory, spreading stories of what they had endured. Their scars mocked the crescent, their crawling bodies a public warning that the road to Wallachia was lined not only with stakes, but with living reminders of what awaited invaders.
With the sole mission of finding and killing Vlad.
Even in Mehmed's court, some envoys reportedly flinched at their own reflections after hearing these stories. But Vlad's terror tactics had made him as dangerous to allies as to enemies. His victory had saved Wallachia for the moment, yet it alarmed Hungary's king Matthias Corvinus. By late autumn of 1462, Vlad rode north seeking support against renewed Ottoman pressure, only to be arrested and locked in Hungary's castle at Visegrad, accused of treachery. He spent about 4 years in confinement, while his brother Radu, favored by the Ottomans, ruled Wallachia in his place. Released in 1466, Vlad lived quietly in Buda for a decade, converting to Catholicism and marrying into the Hungarian court. In 1476, he returned to Wallachia with Moldavian allies, reclaiming the throne at the age of 45. Within months, the Ottomans struck back. Vlad, commanding barely 2,000 men, faced an invasion of about 4,000 Ottoman cavalry. He was killed in battle near the end of that year. Accounts differ on his death. Some say he fell to an enemy blade, others that he was betrayed by his own men. His head was reportedly sent to Mehmed in Constantinople, preserved in honey and displayed on a spike, a grimly fitting end for the man who had made the stake his signature. Vlad's campaigns never toppled the Ottoman Empire, but his ruthless methods stalled it for years, scarred its armies, and left a legend that reshaped both regional politics and global myth. From nationalist hero to Bram Stoker's vampire, the shadow of the Impaler still lingers. Which of Vlad's tactics shocked you the most, or most broke Ottoman morale? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you want to explore more of history's darkest chapters, and the figures who bent empires with fear alone? Make sure to subscribe, because the past still has shadows left to uncover. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.